Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 267 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Winter. For much of North America, winter represents a period of cold, ice, snow, and darkness. For some, this period of cold, ice, snow, and darkness means a fun season of recreation, while for others, winter is a time to hunker down indoors, and it's a season that can't end fast enough. In our 21st century, Americans have different experiences with and feelings about winter, which raises the question, how did the people of early America experience and feel about winter? Thomas Wickman is an associate professor of history and American studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He's also the author of Snowshoe Country, an environmental and cultural history of winter in the early American Northeast. Tom is an expert in early American wintertime experiences, and he joins us today to help answer our questions about how Native Americans and early Americans experienced and felt about winter during the 17th and early 18th centuries. Now, as we trek through what Tom describes as snowshoe country, Tom reveals details about winter in the 17th and early 18th century Northeast, information about how Native American peoples thought about and experienced winter during the 17th and early 18th centuries, and what the English colonists of New England made of winter and its cold, snowy weather. But first, the best way for podcasts to find new listeners is by word-of-mouth recommendations from friends, family, and coworkers. So this holiday season, as you gather with your friends, family, and coworkers, please think about sharing Ben Franklin's World with them. And thank you for your support. All right, are you ready to trek through the early American Northeast's snowshoe country? You should bundle up, because now it's time to meet our guest historian. Our guest is an associate professor of history and American studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. His research interests are in early American, environmental, and Native American history. He's written several journal articles, a book chapter, and a book, Snowshoe Country, an environmental and cultural history of winter in the early American Northeast. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Thomas Wickman.
Thanks, Liz.
So the thing about winter is, our experiences with winter really depend on where we live, where we grew up, and the different time periods that we're talking about. So, as we are about to embark on an exploration of winter in the early American Northeast, Tom, could you tell us what winters were like in early America and why it's a season that fascinates you?
You could say that winter weather distracted me while I was in grad school in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Walking to and from the library on dark, cold nights, I often wondered how people in the past thought about snow and ice. And the more I read, it became clear to me that historians narrated winter episodes from time to time, but rarely examined the structural processes of wintering year after year. As for kind of the general question about what winter was like in the past, the short answer is that winters in the 17th century were colder in the American Northeast than they had been in previous centuries, and colder than they have been since then. In numerical terms, 17th century temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere were around 2 degrees Fahrenheit colder than 20th century averages. And as you can imagine, if you spent time in the Northeast, as I know you have, average temperature difference of 2 degrees Fahrenheit or more made a big difference between rainfall and snowfall, or between a thaw and stable ice or snow. So with that colder weather, the season itself, winters were longer. There were more days with snow cover, and certain periods like the early 1640s, the early and mid and late 1690s, really the whole decade of the 1690s, were really, really cold. So the longer context for this colder weather is a climatic period called the Little Ice Age. Environmental historians and climate historians are now zeroing in on particular fluctuations within that longer story and examining the specific social and cultural circumstances of how people experienced changing weather. People don't experience weather quantitatively, or at least they didn't in the early modern period. They observed how the cold worked spatially, and they brought their cultural values to these ways of seeing and navigating winter. For Penobscot Sagamore Medakawando, who led a January 1692 raid on York, Maine, the stable snowpack facilitated smooth snowshoe travel on the way to and from the raid. And in general, the longer winter left time for Wabanaki people to attend to winter subsistence activities before a strike like the one on York and after. In a different way, for Samuel Sewall, a Boston merchant, frozen harbors interrupted shipping, icy urban streets presented daily perils, and snowdrifts made horseback travel difficult. Urban spaces cleared of trees were exposed to the wind in ways that made the city streets feel much colder. And for someone like Samuel Sewall's son, who worked for a time in a poorly heated bookshop, he suffered from the cold standing around all day, probably with inadequate shoes, and had to leave the job. So it really depended where you were and who you were. From year to year, English colonists easily dismissed one cold season, but when several cold winters happened in succession, as in the 1690s, almanac makers and others changed their expectations. So almanacs began to predict more snow, and almanacs even inserted poems or essays asking whether the climate was getting colder. Samuel Sewall himself wrote apocalyptic poetry to work through his feelings about the weather. So, seeing this diversity of experience, the broader question for me in this project became, were longer, colder winters better or worse? And for whom? For many early English settlers, winter may have seemed like what William Cronin has called a season of want. But that's a culturally specific perspective. And the more that I researched this book, the more that I saw many indigenous people of the Northeast saw winter as a season of abundance, a season of storytelling, and even a season of power. So over time, I really came to ask what structures of power made winter into a season of want for particular people. Perhaps the most awful example of this is the internment of hundreds of Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and other allied people on Deer Island in Boston Harbor in the winter of 1676 during King Philip's War, causing many to die of malnutrition or illness. Or to take another example, in the winter of 1686, 3 Native individuals froze to death on Boston Neck, a narrow pathway into and out of the city. What made winter fatal for these 2 women and 1 man at that place a decade after King Philip's War? In what ways was winter suffering unnatural? It's common for historians to write about brutal winters or cruel freezing winds, but as I see it, these adjectives often would be better applied to structures of colonialism.
Early American winters sound very cold and, depending on who you were, really unpleasant in the early American Northeast. And speaking of who you were, Tom, you mentioned several individuals and people. Samuel Sewall and his son, Nipmuc, Wampanoag, and other Native American peoples. So how did you define the early American Northeast for the purposes of your study, and where do and did all these different people live?
Yeah, I'm looking at a bigger Northeast than just southern New England. So for me, Wabanaki territories in present-day New Brunswick, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont are just as central as, say, the colonial cities of Boston or Hartford. And the book really centers on 2 spaces, one vast and one quite small. So the big space is the collective territory of Algonquian-speaking indigenous nations of the Northeast. I'm most interested in Wabanaki peoples, including Pennicooks in present-day northeastern Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Kennebecs, Penobscots, and Passamaquoddies in Maine, and Maliseets and Micmacs in what people today call New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. The book also looks at winter practices and actions among Algonquian language speakers further south, down to Nipmucs, Wampanoags, Narragansetts, Niantics, Pequots, Mohegans, and many other people. So that's one big space, native space. The other smaller space is the set of English colonies of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, established mainly along the coasts and along a few river valleys. These colonies were diverse in their own ways, but all invested in the common project of settler colonialism. So across that space, there are variations in expected temperatures over the course of the winter. And of course, that changes depending on latitude, on whether you're on the coast where things are a little more moderate or the interior where they tend to be a little colder, or by elevation. And the key thing to think about spatially for me is that colonists were intentionally seeking out spaces with more moderate weather. And while indigenous nations also enjoyed and held those territories on the coast, in wintertime, many indigenous peoples sought out colder spaces. So again, scholars may use the words like terrible or horrible about certain kinds of winter weather, but it really depends who we're talking about. And so even in southern New England, many indigenous nations traveled dozens of miles to winter hunting grounds with more stable snow. And certainly in what we today call northern New England, Wabanaki people sought out winter lands year after year where they lived a good winter life.
Yeah, one of the interesting aspects of your book, Snowshoe Country, is how you look at Native Americans and early Europeans who live within the same region, the Northeast, and yet Native Americans and European colonists seem to have experienced winters really differently from each other. And I'd like for us to explore some of those differences. So, Tom, would you tell us about how Native American peoples in the Northeast experienced winter and about their vast knowledge of the region's winters? Because they would have had a really long time to adapt to Northeastern winters.
Yeah. As you say, thousands of years of experience with changing climates and different political and social situations meant that Native communities had deep reservoirs of knowledge to draw upon. Specific tribal nations had winter stories to recall, technologies to use, and diverse kin and allies to consult. Just to take the example of winter manufacturers, things that people made in cold weather. In northern New England, Wabanaki men and women crafted snowshoes throughout the winter. In territory much further south, present-day Rhode Island and Connecticut, Narragansetts and Pequots spent weeks in winter making wampum. As I researched the book, I spent quite a while learning as much as possible about how people made clothes, footwear, and housing. But I didn't put all that in the book because I became convinced that while practical adaptations mattered, the stories people told, the vocabularies they developed, and the values they expressed mattered even more fundamentally to winter well-being. One of the most widely shared winter traditions among Native communities, not just in the Northeast, but elsewhere on the continent, is to reserve winter as the season for telling stories, for educating new generations about the world. It's easy to contrast colonial indigenous approaches to housing in the early 17th century, but verbal practices may have been more significant to living well in winter. In the book, I note translations for Algonquian names of winter months, the terms used to describe snowshoeing and snowshoe making, and the phrases used by contemporary poets to describe their own understandings of cultural continuance. One example of a resonant phrase comes from a marginal annotation that Josiah or Francis Ned made in an Algonquian Bible in eastern Massachusetts in February 1715. The handwritten note is in Algonquian, refers to multiple great snows that winter, and records observations of yet another snowfall. Once the storm is over, the author writes, "We Indians still survive well on this morning." And that led me to ask, what does it mean to survive well? How do people greet the winter dawn? In some ways, these existential questions are harder to figure out than how people built a wetu or wigwam, or how they incorporated European furniture and cooking implements into that space.
So, what are some of the stories that Native peoples told and perhaps still tell about winter?
Well, I wouldn't recount a story, but I could kind of talk about some of the topics that come up. Wabanaki people have told a lot of stories about a culture hero named Gluskabe, and some of those stories feature moose hunts that cover up to 100 miles of well-known territory within, to take one example, the Penobscot homeland, kind of linking the interior winter spaces to coastal spaces in a single story and linking together numerous named locations where landscape features would remind people of a deep time story. Some of those Gluskabe stories explain how the world was made more habitable, how winter was made bearable for the people. And that takes place, in the beginning of time, assuring those listening to the story and being taught about how to live well in their homeland that, generations of their ancestors have lived in that better space made for them. And over the course of those stories, there are practical lessons or elements of like navigating winter spaces, but there are also social and even kind of philosophical lessons about how to be patient, how to deal with inconveniences and stay together as a group. The kinds of stories really are infinite, had access to only some of those. They're living stories, they change over time, but some of my favorite ones that I've learned about have to do with the little things in winter. And that could include activities like frost fishing, going to spots where small fish with antifreeze in their system come up to spawn under the ice of small brooks in December or early January. And so stories about a frost fishing season can be stories not about some big struggle against an overwhelming force of winter, but it's a small thing that makes life better to gather frost fish and share them in a feast within a well-known homeland. Other small things that show up in stories are snowshoe hares, well-adapted animals that live well in winter and therefore maybe teach you something about the possibilities out there on winter lands.
You mentioned that these are living stories. So, how do you as a historian research these living stories? And do you have any sense about how these stories have changed or been adapted over time?
Yeah, it's been a long process and I have proceeded patiently and as respectfully as possible. I've been mentored by people like, well, particularly by Amherst scholar Lisa Brooks, who really pushed me to engage with the language to the extent that I could, with oral tradition, with contemporary poetry as different manifestations of how communities that have persisted continue to carry culture and modify it and interpret it. So the Penobscot Nation, Passamaquoddies, there are large Wabanaki communities that still speak the language and are teaching new generations the language. And over time, some members of Penobscots, Passamaquoddies, Maliseets have put into print some of their stories. And so I've closely read those to the extent that I could, and I don't quote them at length, but I try to learn from them. And I also, spent a little time traveling up to meet with Penobscot tribal historian James Eric Francis and Passamaquoddy tribal historian Donald Saktoma. They know a lot more than I do and shared some of their knowledge with me. But, these traditions really are theirs to keep. And I'm looking kind of at the interface between their historical communities and colonizers over many generations and how, there's some exchange that has gone on that's really crucial. There's struggles for power, but there's also a lot of autonomy that Wabanakis and other tribal communities have maintained as they've survived and persisted and carried their communities forward.
So it sounds like your research process includes the ability to research written historical records in the archives, as well as this ability to talk to people who really know about these traditions and oral stories and oral histories that can really help guide your research and understanding of winter in the early American Northeast.
Yeah, I would say that's true. I mean, I think that the stories helped me ask different questions. When I came to the project, I had a little bit more universalized view of the kinds of struggles that people might have in cold environments. And the stories suggested to me that there are profound differences in how people experience winter. And conversations with people who had thought about this for a long time, pushed me in that direction. But, I wouldn't necessarily even, draw too strong a distinction between oral tradition and written archival records. You know, tribal historians and contemporary communities, they're producing tons of printed material, both for members of the community and for a broader public. I mentioned poets. Abenaki poet Cheryl Savageau is a historian too. I mean, she writes about history. She engages critically with history. And, I come from an American studies background partly, and I'm very kind of open to putting a lot of different kinds of ways of thinking and dialogue with each other. And I think that's made this project better. I mean, I certainly use plenty of English language, 17th century sources, diaries, almanacs, letters, histories of war, captivity narratives, natural history writing, promotional narratives. There's a lot of written material, and I spent a lot of time with those documents. But could I have interpreted those documents well without being mentored, by members of contemporary Native communities in the Northeast? I don't know. I think it would have been really difficult to get to some of the insights that I got to without, being educated by people with, in many cases, with a different frame of reference. I mean, multiple frames of reference for sure, but frames of reference that I hadn't been taught to consider initially in my education.
That's really neat that you had such a wide and diverse set of historical sources that you could use. And to touch upon that a bit, to ask a related question, you mentioned earlier that you did a lot of research into the technology that Native Americans developed around wintertime clothing and shoes. And I wonder if you could tell us about some of that technology, like snowshoes.
Yeah, I mean, really the central winter practices that I look at are snowshoe making and snowshoeing, because these practices unlock so many other kinds of winter knowledge. Snowshoes were an indigenous technology common to many indigenous peoples across the continent. They were central to Wabanaki winter life, and also some native neighbors to the south used snowshoes, including nipmucks. Snowshoe making was a continual process shared by women and men within a community. The frames of the snowshoes were made of flexible wood, often white ash, and men cut the wood and bent it into shape. The filling or webbing was made of rawhide from moose, white-tailed deer, or caribou, and women wove the netting with needles into intricate patterns. There was no single design for snowshoes. The size and shape of a pair of snowshoes depended on the snow conditions at the time, a person's size, the kinds of activities they were carrying out, and so on. People crafted snowshoes on the go, adapting to changing situations, and it's possible that they used multiple snowshoes for different winter lands within their traditional territories. Snowshoeing was a collective activity crucial to winter travel, hunting, trapping, gathering, and innumerable other cold weather tasks. With snowshoes, Native communities accessed the wide and varied winterlands of the Northeast. Snowshoe paths within Wabanaki homelands connected subsistence sites and villages and allowed people to visit kin and allies. This technology wasn't just for recreational outings as it might be for some people in the 21st century. Snowshoes were key to living well in winter intergenerationally. So the contemporary Abenaki poet Cheryl Savageau has a poem in which the speaker responds to a foundational 17th century report written by Jesuit missionary Pierre Biard. The poem asks a number of rhetorical questions to show how little Biard knew about what made life good in the Northeast. And one of those questions is, had Biard ever designed and crafted snowshoes for the whole family? Just about anybody could eventually learn to snowshoe, but only if someone made the right snowshoes for them. And snowshoe making was a harder skill to acquire and a slower skill to perfect. And indeed, although one of the stories that I tell in the book is that English settlers and military forces eventually appropriated snowshoes, that adaptation of snowshoes was always incomplete. And in the early 18th century, when English soldiers started to go out and patrol Wabanaki winterlands on snowshoes, it's very hard to know who made those snowshoes. In some cases, it seems to have been native captives. The snowshoes that were made by English settlers might have only faintly resembled traditional snowshoes that were, crafted with great care among Wabanakis and others in the Northeast. And so, I've had to think a lot about what is adaptation and what does it mean to incompletely or partially adapt a technology like this.
You noted that anyone could snowshoe if they had the right snowshoes, and as I read your book, Snowshoe Country, I was really fascinated by the sheer variety of snowshoes. So, would you tell us about the different types of snowshoes and how different snowshoes would have been used in different conditions?
There's only one photograph of snowshoes in the book. If your listeners wanted to see a wide range of photographs of snowshoes that are held in contemporary collections and museums and then put on display for the public, the University of Maine's Hudson Museum did a online exhibit called Snowshoes, a Gift from Gluskabe that's really excellent way to see these. So my first chapter talks about snowshoe making, snowshoeing, and different winter ecologies that people on snowshoes could get to know. And while I do start kind of talking about a range of types of snowshoes, I guess I resist kind of giving an anatomy of snowshoes or like an elaborate typology because I see it as a dynamic technology that's only, partly possible to understand at this 400 years distance that I'm at. Most of the surviving snowshoes that you'd see if you went to this website or that you'd see in a museum are about 100 years old, maybe 140 years old. And why is that? It's because people use snowshoes. If they're good snowshoes, you're going to use them, and they're not going to last forever. They're made of perishable materials. So I'm resisting a little bit going into the material culture side of things in just the way that you might be asking, because I don't want listeners to come away thinking of there being a kind of platonic ideal of a snowshoe. There are interrelated factors that snowshoe makers took into account. And so I think there, were thousands of different sizes and shapes and colors and weaves and patterns of snowshoes in the past. And we can only know some of them. In that regard, I trust the stories almost more than I trust the artifacts.
Now, in your book, Snowshoe Country, we learned that winter supported the social dynamics of Native American families. So, would you tell us about the ways that winter supported Native American families and their social dynamics?
Snowshoes, as I say, unlock access to a wide range of kind of winter spaces. And that matters a lot because of how unpredictable winter weather was. In extremely mild, rainy periods of a winter, when stable snowpack wasn't around to support travel over long distances, it made travel risky, where, the last thing you want to do is fall into cold water or go out on ice that you can't trust or deal with mud. During conditions like that, people might access shellfish gathering sites or fishing sites. If, weather changed and the expected kind of stable snowpack settled in by January and seemed like it would last as it usually did until March, then people could travel to interior hunting grounds. And, that could include areas with abundant moose, where moose might have been yarding up in small groups and could be hunted on snowshoes. There are some parts of present day northern New England where there are no longer caribou, but there were in the 17th century. So it depended on the particular family and village and their decision making process that took into account political and economic considerations from year to year. So snowshoes kind of link together a number of subsistence spaces. And while kind of in early winter, trapping of fur bears could be important, I tend to emphasize the subsistence imperatives, even of trapping of beaver and other small animals. Yeah, you get pelts from those animals, but quite often you get quite a bit of sustenance from them too. And so early winter, had a different menu, so to speak, than late winter. So by going between these subsistence territories that are well known, that are named, Wabanaki families and other Native people of the Northeast are laying claim to their winter lands within a big territory. So, this is not necessarily exactly the picture you get from English colonial sources that see seasonal mobility as maybe a little more random or a kind of bare subsistence, if the colonial sources even mention Native people in winter at all. What's clear to me from a wide range of sources is that winter was a season people really looked forward to. And part of that was getting away from the coasts that were sites of conflict. Certainly sites where trade was taking place and exchange and learning was going on. But in the context of 17th century colonization, by spreading out in winter, and sometimes in family hunting bands as few as 10 to 12 people, Native families could lay claim to winter lands, practice winter traditions, share winter knowledge. show a kind of material independence and signal, sovereignty and autonomy to English newcomers. So what often, comes up in just a sentence or two in English source about native neighbors relocating to an interior site for the winter, there's a lot going on there. There's a whole story to be told, and that's partly what I'm trying to do with this book. There aren't that many English accounts of long winters going from place to place, but one place you can look is in captivity narratives. So one example is we could think of John Giles, who was an English boy taken captive from Pemaquid in 1689. He spent 6 winters with Maliseets following winter game from Meductic all the way up to the Upper Gaspé Peninsula. He learned to travel on snowshoes. He was traveling with, a group of men, women, and children. And, he mentions over and over again that they're killing moose wherever they go in winter. And in this case, with guns. So captivity narratives complain a lot about that learning process of being out and moving amongst and between winter lands with native captors. But they're being educated. It's really clear that they're being fed and taught and treated medically, and they're getting an education that they couldn't have gotten anywhere else about winters in the Northeast, and not just winters within 10 or 20 miles of the coast.
Yeah, the picture I got from snowshoe country was really one where Native Americans didn't seem to view winter as this bad season full of fear and cold, but the colonists seemed to have a really different relationship with winter than local Native American peoples. And to this end, Stessa would like to know about the experiences European colonists had with winter. So, would you tell us something about that?
So, the first settlers in what we today call New England had been born in England and raised in a climate with few days of snow cover per winter. They came from a culture in which, people talked about frost and ice and really didn't talk a whole lot about snow. It wasn't a big factor in their lives, that kind of deep, stable snow cover. When English settlers invaded coastal territories, they saw extensive meadows that they knew could support their livestock over the winter in the form of hay. As I read through letters and diaries from the 17th century, it was clear how homebound and townbound people were from December to March. They were busy. They did a lot of work inside the house or just outside the house. They were able to make visits within town and maybe even to neighboring towns, but they rarely traveled long distance in the colder months. They also were in the habit of describing their winter lives as relatively static, as a season with little news, sporadic political activity, the rationing of supplies, and they hoped that the winter would represent a reprieve from war. At the same time, though, their year-round presence in the Northeast was resource intensive, and that's something that their native neighbors certainly were watching and historicizing over the years. Colonists never, ever simply struggled with the cold, even though they described it that way. They had a providential way of narrating some of their ordeals in wintertime, but they were always on native lands, and their narratives tended to make indigenous people less visible, even though native nations were always there influencing their experiences. Generations into colonization, that was still true. And to the extent that colonization is not over, that's still true. I'll say parenthetically that climate proxies can tell us a lot about the relative temperature changes, perhaps from year to year or decade to decade. But I hope that we don't let new climatic data distract from the fact that all of this history takes place on native land. Climate history shouldn't be a new way to imagine that colonists are struggling with simply a cold environment or extreme weather.
That's a good point, that we are talking about colonists living on native lands and native peoples who were always around to influence colonial experiences with winter and other seasons. And Tumek would like to know more about how Native Americans influence colonial experiences with winter. So, what wintertime lessons did Native Americans impart to colonists?
One thing that you find over and over again in the 1620s and 1630s is that early settlers are getting lost in winter just a few miles from home. And quite often, native first responders, Wampanoag people, Narragansetts, and others are rescuing them, are giving them aid, giving them medical treatment. Colonists often traveled by boat in winter if they could, and that meant they were always in danger of getting soaking wet and exposing themselves to possibly fatal hypothermia. And so they often narrate the experience very quickly with a kind of providential frame and a brief mention that a native first responder appeared to help them. But of course, that's because, they're on Wampanoag lands or Narragansett lands and people are watching and deciding when to intervene and when to stay at a distance. There's also fascinating cultural exchange that's happening. And the very first winters have been well studied. Recently, Sam White and Kathleen Donegan have analyzed really closely the first years of several sediments, including their winters. I devote a few pages to these winters too. I think they're important, but I think that every winter mattered. I frame the book chronologically from roughly 1620 through the 1720s, so about 100 winters, but I'm also interested in the millennia of winters that preceded that and the centuries of winters since. And, part of this is I'm responding to the work of Jean O'Brien, who has cautioned historians against recycling the trope that European colonists were the first to do something in New England. She calls this firsting. And I think that we as colonial environmental historians could be much more conscious and critical about undoing that narrative convention. That being said, early colonists learned a lot of practical things about what to eat and not eat or how to treat themselves in particular predicaments. So there's evidence that settlers at Plymouth and Wessagusset learned to dig up ground nuts for winter subsistence, and that colonists at Mattapan or Dorchester learned very early to subsist on frostfish. The proper storage of maize was crucial to winter well-being, and that's something that's learned from native neighbors with centuries of experience harvesting and storing maize. Colonists don't seem to have been very interested in learning the kind of broader cultural context, listening to stories, adjusting a worldview in a way that might have taught them to live differently in winter. And as Anya Zilberstein has shown in a recent book, colonists also really hoped that the climate would quickly become much more moderate, that they wouldn't have to deal with long winters for very long. And so these are provisional adaptations that they're making in the first decades of settlement. And what interests me even more than that first wave of education from kind of native mentors is a second generation of education through the process of war. So soldiers and captives in the wars of the late 17th century were forced into new situations where they received education, practical guidance from native captors, and to some extent learned in opposition to native communities that they were fighting against. And this second wave of learning was much more in depth because it entailed much more extensive travel across the region. So captives learned to snowshoe, to forage, to preserve food, to repair winter clothing, to administer cold weather medicine. And captivity narratives tell us a lot, but I think it's only a fraction of the knowledge that captors imparted over the months or years that they held these English captives. I have a suspicion that English writers especially de-emphasize native women's knowledge of plants and their skilled winter labor in the time that the captives spent with those native women. And what comes through clearly is that there are long-lasting consequences of those decades of war. And colonists are ambivalent about what they've learned. They don't necessarily always pass it on, but many former captives worked as interpreters or diplomats. And the more difficult question is when women returned from captivity and didn't put their knowledge into those kinds of occupations, how did they put it to work in English communities that they returned to? So early on, you have the stories of aid, and later on, you have the stories of education by force. Colonists, in both cases, were pretty ambivalent about the knowledge that they were taking. And within 4 or 5 generations, a lot of the knowledge that they had taken through these waves of education is newly framed, in the mid 18th century within a kind of nostalgic discourse that hardly credits the native sources of that knowledge at all, that begins to just look back at what former generations of English settlers had done and tends to make either quaint or exotic practices like snowshoeing or frost fishing or eating ground nuts. And the reason that that matters is it depoliticizes the process of education that had happened and the particular context within which English settlers had learned, how to do things or how to find foods. So by the time you get to people talking about quote unquote New England winters as something that like everybody kind of understands, there are these layers of history that they're often not talking about. They're usually not, when they're talking about New England winters, they're not talking about war. They're not talking about land dispossession, and they're not crediting, native knowledge. Wabanaki snowshoe makers who had initially taught English colonists to make snowshoes. So now at some point, snowshoes become, decorative. There's something you put on the wall. And that's a long way from, something that you're remaking over the course of a long winter season to connect, winter lands to each other across great distances.
I'm glad you brought up ground nuts because Albert is curious about the foods that Native Americans and colonists would have consumed during wintertime. And he's actually very interested in learning more about ground nuts and what kinds of nuts made up ground nuts.
Yeah, ground nuts are legumes with edible tubers that are rich in starch and protein. The Latin name is Apios americana. When winter foragers wanted ground nuts, they searched along riverbanks, swamp edges, and other moist areas, and they dug through the snow and soil. Ground nuts could be harvested year round, but the tubers were sweeter in early winter, and they were a reliable source of winter nutrition. One fascinating question posed by Sam White recently is whether colder temperatures made it impossible, or at least much more difficult, for Native people or colonists to access foods like this under the soil. I didn't find references to frozen soil becoming an obstacle to foraging. And in fact, Mary Rowlandson, during her captivity in King Philip's War in the winter of 1676, thought that English soldiers should track native war parties in winter by looking for the spots where they dug up the ground nuts. And I'll just say quickly that, ground nuts are one of these examples of, a minor winter food. It's not the same as stores of corn or maize. It's not the same as livestock that settlers and some Wampanoag and other native people might have slaughtered in early winter. It's not the same as killing a moose and harvesting the meat and other edible parts of the moose for winter feasts. But these, what you might call minor foods, they mattered a lot. Just to give other examples, I mentioned frostfish that, come up to spawn in small streams in early winter. I think it's well known that Wabanaki people killed porcupines and used the quills in all kinds of artistic forms, but they also roasted and ate the flesh of porcupines. At certain times, people made winter teas from the bark of trees. And in contemporary Native poetry and in some oral tradition, people speak lovingly of winter meats and winter teas, of the kind of small things in winter that all fit together to make it a season that people look forward to. And that has to do with, knowledge that intergenerationally, the combination of those things has provided good sustenance, complete nutrition. But also, I think it's about preserving knowledge and respecting the wide range of things that people could eat, the edible landscape that really was much more varied than newcomers than England could understand.
Now, you mentioned many ways that Native Americans impacted the ways that colonists experienced winter. Was this reciprocal relationship at all? Did colonists have any impact on the ways that Native Americans experienced winter?
Yeah, so it depends when we're talking about that. I mean, I think the most crucial period in my book is when English colonists in 1704 put snowshoes systematically to military use. And thereafter, regularly in wartime, there are winter patrols of up to several hundred men sent out to crisscross Wabanaki winter subsistence grounds and make it much harder to winter well for Wabanaki families. What's important to understand about that turning point is that the weather had been cold for quite some time. The 1690s, as I mentioned, that was a very cold decade, but it was actually a change in military policy that made winter what William Cronin initially called a season of want. So it hadn't been a season of want, is what I argue, for Wabanakis before in the same way. It had been a good season. And one expression of Wabanaki consciousness of that change comes from a 19th century source that looked back to this period in the early 18th century and claimed that as a result of English military policies that were newly depriving Wabanakis of access to their subsistence grounds, the Wabanakis actually changed the name of the moon or month they used around the time between January and February. It had been, and this is particularly among Kennebecs, it had been a word meaning the cold is great, a description of the temperature, the cold is great. But it was replaced by a new word sometime in the early 18th century, meaning it's hard to get a living. So if the former described just the weather, the latter described a new political ecology imposed by colonists. And, in the commentary in this 19th century source, that's quite explicit. So environmental historians sometimes assume a decline in subsistence sources as a result of overharvesting, and thereby they miss this other story of just cutting off access to winter subsistence grounds that, from all the evidence I can see, were quite abundant. So in northern New England, there were still plenty of moose to hunt. The problem was that there are now English patrols interfering with that hunt. The decline of moose didn't occur until the late 18th century. That's a story about power. And for previous historians, it's been more of a story about simply the weather or a story about overhunting or overtrapping. And I think previous historians have really missed the crucial change, which is kind of cutting off snowshoe paths, getting in the way of the connective infrastructure that had made winter good if people could just adapt to changing conditions and move between their winter lands.
So, Tom, just before we jump into the time warp here, why do you think we need to study and better understand the early American experience with winter?
I think the industrialized world in particular should spend time learning about periods of history before the intensive use of fossil fuels. This is a claim that Joyce Chaplin has made, and I totally agree. I also think we should study cultural contexts within which colder weather was considered better. There are a lot of great new books about cold places, and actually many of them have light blue cover designs, either, light blue landscapes of ice and snow or, light blue lettering. And I think that may represent what I've called a light blue turn in the environmental humanities, a shift to really take seriously the colder half of the year and all its subtlety and with all the cultural nuances that matter at a given time and place. So Julie Cruikshank's book, Do Glaciers Listen, is one example, but there are numerous examples of the great new work out there. In North America, if we're just going to take the long view and the big zoomed out picture, winter has been a really big part of the millennia long history of 600 plus native nations. And I think historians are ignoring half the story if they focus mainly on warm weather encounters or conflicts. I don't think I've mentioned it so far in our conversation, but I've asked whether there is a vernal bias in the scholarship on early North America. Historians have a tendency to narrate warm weather processes of agriculture, transatlantic shipping, and war as dynamic forces that drove history forward. There are other forces, and there are other things that were central that happened in the colder half of the year. But it's surprisingly common for scholars to use a sentence, or even less, to skip over winter, linking one summer to the next, jumping from October to April in the blink of an eye. And I think part of this has to do with people following too closely the colonial primary sources. This is particularly a problem with English sources. French sources do include a little bit more about winters across the continent. But, particular genres like chronicles and timelines written in the 17th and 18th centuries regularly just skipped over winter. And I think more broadly, this way of narrating history marks warm or mild weather as normative, just as settlers wished it would become. So I mentioned Anya Zilberstein's book that really studies this mental habit and the discourses about anthropogenic warming over time from the early colonial period forward. So it's there right in front of our eyes. If you look at promotional narratives, they promised a warmer future within generations. Other English writers spent time in other ways to kind of get around the problem of winter. Cotton and Increase Mather assured parishioners there would be no winter in the afterlife. Samuel Sewall wrote an apocalyptic tract that imagined a millennium of mild weather and everlasting colonization. In response to particular events like the Great Snow of 1717, people expressed their vernal wishes so interesting ways. In 1717, the province of Massachusetts held a public fast to quote unquote bless the springing of the year, or to bring what they saw as better weather back. And I think underneath all these expressions are deep wishes for a moderate climate, warm weather, an easy life that are kind of colonial in nature, and they haven't entirely left many English speakers in this country. Obviously, that is a problem when we're trying to build public will to mitigate or reverse global warming.
Now we should jump into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Tom, in your opinion, what might have happened if winters in the North American Northeast had been warmer? How would the early American history of the Northeast be different if winter had been more mild?
If I wanted to be difficult, I would say that this is not exactly a counterfactual. The colonial era is still going, and the weather is in fact getting warmer. So it depends how we define the question. And as I mentioned, Anya Zilberstein's work is all about how Euro-Americans have consciously hoped, planned, and schemed for anthropogenic climate change. But to answer the question more directly, and maybe still in a little bit of a contrarian way, I think it's entirely possible that there would have been worse conflict earlier if average temperatures had been significantly higher in the early 17th century. Certainly, you could find evidence from warmer 16th century and early 17th century sites of European invasion to see that mild weather did not necessarily produce peaceful relations. Far from it. And this is, consistent with the questions I've asked about how longer winters empowered Native communities, and particularly Wabanaki people, at least for a few generations during the colonial early process of colonization. I think, there are some important questions for early American climate historians and environmental historians to ask going forward. If you look at really excellent recent work by people like Kate Grandjean or Sam White, I think there's an assumption underlying that scholarship that extreme weather events like hurricanes, droughts, or frigid winters depleted food supplies and thus exacerbated conflict between colonizers and indigenous communities. And I find that students are very taken by these arguments. There is a lot to be said for them. And, the more work on these topics, the better. I think there's also more to be debated. And when it comes to our public facing work as climate historians or environmental historians, I worry from my experience in the classroom that sometimes students walk away from some of our work remembering more about the disastrous effects of extreme weather events and less about the catastrophic effects of colonialism. And I'm not sure that's the intention of our scholarship. And I think we could do better. And this counterfactual question that you've asked kind of helps me, think more about that. How do we keep settler colonialism or other forms of colonization at the center of the story, even as we pay very close attention to climatic fluctuations or environmental change?
So, Tom, now that you've studied winter in the early American Northeast, are you sticking around with colder climate studies, or are you researching something else?
To be determined. I don't know what the seasonal balance of my next project will be. I have gotten started. I do know where it'll be centered. I teach at Trinity College in Hartford, and I'm researching the Wangunk village of Sukyog along the Connecticut River, right where Hartford now lies. So I'm reading through the documents about 17th century Sukyog, and there at that site, the Wangunk sachem was named Sequasin when English settlers arrived to found the colonial city of Hartford. And Sequasin's life intertwined in fascinating ways with the life of the first colonial governor of Connecticut and a major early landholder, John Haynes. And in this project, I'm trying to link the 17th to the 21st century in new ways that pay attention to indigeneity and to environment. So in 21st century Hartford, which still occupies the traditional territory of Wangunk people, Hartford residents would be hard-pressed to find public acknowledgement of Indigenous history or presence in the public monuments of Connecticut's state capital. John Haynes is well represented by statues and memorials constructed in the 19th and 20th centuries by descendant organizations. But there's little acknowledgement of his conflicts with Sequasin. He repeatedly accused Sequasin of conspiracies against him, and the consequences of those allegations against Sequasin were the erosion of Sequasin's authority at particular times. Of course, Sequasin was persistent and remained a leader of his people. And there's actually very little scholarship on Haynes or Sequasin. So I'm trying to research the grounded history there next to the Connecticut River, which itself is a dynamic space. It's changing in response to floods and other factors over the course of the 17th century. And all of this is partly to inform something that's happening all along the Connecticut River and in Hartford in particular, which is a return to the river. Residents are trying to connect with the river again, and activists and public officials are trying to facilitate that process of kind of opening the river back up. There's an organization in Hartford called Riverfront Recapture that holds events along the river and promotes the restoration of the health of the river and public access to the river. But I'm interested in whether we, as people who live here in this stretch of the river, could recover not just a pre-industrial relationship with the Connecticut River, but a decolonial relationship with that river. So that's a project that I'm pretty excited about going forward.
And if we have more questions about Native American history or winter in the early American Northeast, what's the best way to contact you?
Oh, my online profile at the Trinity College website has the information that anybody would need.
Thomas Wickman, thank you for taking us through snowshoe country and for helping us better understand what it was like to winter in the early American Northeast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
When we look beyond the historical sources produced by English colonists, we find that early Americans and Native Americans had very different experiences with winter. As Tom related, most early American colonists did not like to talk about winter. They viewed winter as a period of great disruption, as a season of want. For colonists, winter was that time of year when rivers and harbors froze over, which greatly disrupted their ability to travel and to ship and receive goods. Plus, colonists also viewed winter as the time when they had to ration food and keep these large smoky fires in their homes just to stay warm. Needless to say, for many colonists, winter was that time of year that just couldn't end fast enough. Northeastern Native Americans, on the other hand, had a very different relationship and experience with winter. Instead of viewing winter as a season of want and disruption, Native Americans viewed winter as a season of power, abundance, and storytelling. As Tom noted, winter snowpacks allowed Native Americans to hunt large game like moose and caribou. It allowed them to connect their coastal homelands with their interior homelands. And it allowed them to make war when necessary. Plus, seasonal familial activities like snowshoe making and storytelling allowed Native American families to connect with each other and to pass on generations of knowledge about winter to future generations. What's clear from the oral and written records that we have about winter is that Native Americans generally look forward to the season, while colonists did not. But from these historical sources, we can also see that Native Americans and colonists greatly impacted and shaped how each group experienced winter. For example, Native Americans shared a lot of knowledge. They taught colonists how to live in native spaces and how to live in winter. They taught colonists about good wintertime foods to look out for and about the usefulness of snowshoes. They also taught colonists that those who could navigate winter terrain held the upper hand when it came to diplomacy and power. And it's clear that some colonists took these lessons to heart. In fact, one of the ways that colonists really impacted the ways that Native Americans experienced winter was by putting snowshoes to military use. After 1704, hundreds of colonial men started to crisscross native lands and conduct wintertime patrols. And these patrols really impacted the ability of native families to winter well, because colonial patrols cut off Native Americans from wintertime hunting grounds and territories and made the threat of war a year-round experience. As Tom revealed, one of the ways that we can get a sense of just how drastically colonists changed the way Northeastern Native Americans experienced winter is in how the Wabanakis changed their word to describe winter. Before colonists, Wabanakis described the winter as, "the cold is great." After colonists really started to impinge on their food supplies and interrupt how they traveled in winter, the Wabanakis changed their word. From then on, they described winter as, "it's hard to get a living." So, how did the people of early America experience and feel about winter? Well, there wasn't one experience with winter. How Native Americans and early Americans answered this question really changed over time and changed with experience, which is kind of where we stand with winter today. Then and now, how we humans experience winter depends on our culture, experiences, and knowledge. You can find more information about Tom, his book, Snowshoe Country, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/267. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Kayla Pittman, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Our custom theme music was composed by Breakmaster Cylinder. Finally, how do you think about and experience winter? How does winter impact your life? I'd really love to know about your experience, so please share it with me. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.